Uncertainty, its definition and rarity compared to confidence. What do we say when we say I'm certain that X? As noted in On Beauty, if Wittgenstein is correct that the limits of my world are the limits of my language, then expressions of my language should be expressions of my world. Thus, if I can isolate a term into distinction, then I should identify a real phenomenon in the world. Words that don't refer to real things are nonsense or blur with other words indefinably. If by I'm certain that X I mean merely I know that X is true, then there is no meaningful difference between the statements X is true and I'm certain that X. The words certainty and truthfulness are similes. If certainty is to have distinct meaning, it must mean something else. I can be certain about something that is true, but it doesn't follow that I am necessarily certain about only true things. If certain and true aren't similes, it is possible for me to be certain about something that is false. Furthermore, it doesn't follow that everything that is true is something I will be certain about, nor that what is false is that which I can't be certain about. The true isn't necessarily the certain, but it's easy to conflate these categories as if they are, contributing to error. Perhaps we can help mitigate error by habituating ourselves to a new term altogether, one like confidence. Section 1. If the statements, I am certain that X and X is a fact, mean the same thing, there is no meaningful difference between facts and certainties, and yet distinctions seem necessary between the categories of truths, facts, and certainties. If I feel sad, it is true that I am sad, in a sense a fact, but the fact of my sadness seems different in kind from the fact 2 plus 2 equals 4. Sadness is subjective, only I can know for a fact that I am sad. Other people can see my tears and frowns and postulate that I am sad, but they can't know for sure. It could all be an act, for example. To me, I'm sad and 2 plus 2 equals 4 are equally true and factual, but to others, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a fact, while my sadness is not. It might be true that I'm sad, and it is true that I look sad, but it's not a fact to others, because there's more uncertainty. What is a fact is also true, but is what's true also a fact? Other works by O.G. Rose explore this question in different ways, arguing that facts are always facts within a network of assumptions about what constitutes a truth, but the point that needs to be stressed here is that facts and truths aren't the same to us. Before gravity was discovered, gravity wasn't a fact, though what we know is a fact about gravity now was always true. Though what we will discover in 100 years is a fact about black holes is currently true, it's not currently a fact, even though it will be. The moment we discuss a fact, we discuss something that is true, and so it's natural to forget that the fact of X isn't the same as the truth of X. Once the rivers merge, it's difficult to remember they are distinct per se. Before gravity was discovered, the fact of why apples fell was different from the truth of why apples fell, and yet if anyone in 1670 postulated this possibility, people may have laughed. Why can't you just accept the facts? And one day, these two premises may prove different again. If what we know about gravity isn't currently all there is to know, though the fact of gravity today is more truth-like than the fact of gravity in 1670, it is not as true as the fact of gravity in 2100. And there is always the possibility of a divide. To know what the fact of X is completely, the truth of X, we would have to be omniscient and godlike. Thanks to Karl Popper and falsification, though, we can reach a point where we have no reason to believe that the fact of X isn't practically identical with the truth of X, but even then, there is still reason to be intellectually humble. Truths are what we aim to factualize, per se. Truths are the territory, facts the map. There is always a possible divide between facts and truths. Even if our facts about X completely entail truths about X, we cannot know for sure that this is the case, and thus the possibility of the divide is ever present. Hence, we should always be epistemically humble about our facts, recognizing that though they are true, they may still be incomplete. And if our facts aren't, we can't know it. A fact is an incomplete truth, stuck in a kind of unstable state, causing existential tension, because even when a fact is completely true, we can't know such is the case, as we can't know for sure a fact is incompletely true. We must settle with a bothness, something unsatisfactory. Yet, that all said, a fact is what we have realized is true with certainty. But if we can never say for sure that a truth is the complete truth, in what sense is it meaningful to be certain? Perhaps the phrase, I am certain X is nonsense or unhelpful. Perhaps that is where our journey will ultimately take us. Section 2. If when I say I am certain about X, I mean merely I am justified to believe X, there would be no meaningful difference between certainty and justification. Indeed, certainty can be justified, and what is justified is that which I have reason to be certain of, but while justification seems to be in regard to the how a premise is factualized, certainty seems to be in regard to how we relate to what is factualized. What has been justified is that which we perhaps should relate to with certainty, but it isn't the case that justification and certainty are similes, though again, it is easy to make this mistake since what is justified is what I am rational to be toward with certainty. A fact is that which we have reason to be certain of, while at the same time being that which we can't be certain constitutes the complete truth. Certainty hence plays a significant role in defining fact from truth, and yet what is certainty? How can I be justified to be certain of my certainty? To think that the fact of X is part of the truth of X, for example. This leads us into epistemological methods, the structures of arguments, reasoning, and so on. How I determine X is a fact plays a large role in determining how justified I am to believe X is a truth of the truth. On this point, Karl Popper's falsification seems to be the best tool we have. See Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch for more. And if a premise passes tests of falsification, we seem justified to assume that the premise X is a fact is likely part of the truth of X. Hence, the way I determine a fact seems to play a significant role in determining how justified I am to be certain about the fact and vulnerable toward it, as will be discussed. Justification is methodological and epistemological, while certainty is more relational and phenomenological. If I am to be rational, what I should be certain toward seems tied up with what is justified, and thus for the rational being, certainty should follow justification. But it doesn't seem to be the case that justification should follow certainty. In fact, an irrational person seems to be precisely someone who feels justified in what they are certain about, while a rational person is certain about what is justified. Now, right and rational aren't similes, so it is possible for rational people to be wrong about what they feel certain, and vice versa. But that said, what constitutes being rational seems tied up with one's certainty following justification versus the other way around. A fact is a justified premise. It is what I have reason to believe is partially true, at least, because my arguments contain no internal contradictions, have withstood continual testing, and so on. If a premise is justified and or a fact, I have reason to be certain toward it, and hence my certainty is rational. Since it is possible for me to be certain toward that which is unjustified, irrational certainty is possible, as is rational certainty. Considering this, being rational and being certain are not similes. If they are meaningful, they are distinct. Justification seems objective, while certainty seems more subjective, more of a way a subject is toward others. When we engage in justification, we seem to be submitting our subjectivity to the authority of a method, because we don't trust our subjectivity, aware of confirmation bias, and so on. When we engage in certainty, we seem to be deciding how our subjectivity should be toward something. While justification is impersonal, certainty seems more personal. Section 3. If when I said I'm certain that X is true, I merely meant I feel that X is true, certain and feel would be similes and lack distinct meaning. That said, certainty does seem to be emotional, or at least an intellectual position that gives rise to an emotional stability. It describes a way we relate to a thing, a relationship. In dealing with emotion, certainty also seems to deal with motivation. It has an impact on how I feel I should interact and engage with a thing. Would facts exist without certainty? Perhaps, but it's hard to imagine that we would have any motivation to define or realize them, not feeling anything to help us recognize that they are indeed facts. The line between facts and unchanging things experienced, per se, would be difficult to draw meaningfully, but if it is indeed the case that we can never say a given truth is all there is of the truth, perhaps we shouldn't be able to draw this line. Perhaps this line contributes to error more than help us overcome it. The less complex the truth, the easier it is to be certain about it. The more complex, the more difficult. 2 + 2 = 4 is much easier to feel certain about than the state should regulate the financial system, and yet both premises could be equally true. Everything that is true is in fact true, but what we can in fact be certain about radically varies because of how we relate and comprehend different truths. The nature of how we relate to a truth changes, how we feel toward it, and hence what we are motivated to do regarding it. But in what ways? To say that I am certain X is to say I have judged my relation to X and determined it reliable. Certainty is a self-judgment. It can seem like it's external to us, something in the world as hard and as concrete as a rock, but rather certainty is found in the space between people and phenomenon. Facts are in the world as themselves, not as facts, but not certainty. However, it can seem like certainty is external because when we experience a fact, certainty can feel part of it. In fact, precisely what makes a fact feel like a fact is our sense of certainty about it. To discuss facts and not certainty seems to be to discuss nonsense, and yet, though where there are less complex facts, there is often certainty, the two are not the same. Though the rivers merge, as has been discussed, facticity and certainty are distinct. To be certain about X is to self-judge, that I should relate to X in a manner that relies on X being true, that I should be vulnerable toward it, as will be discussed. Certainty implies a judgment that further investigation is unnecessary no more than a doorknob that works needs to be studied, to allude to Heidegger. Certainty makes things invisible. In other words, what I am certain about is that which I am motivated to stop pressing into. Certainty is what I feel I can stop thinking about, toward which the philosophical life can die, rationally and problematically, which is dangerous, and yet something like certainty is necessary. In uncertainty, Wittgenstein notes that it belongs to the logic of our scientific investigations that certain things are indeed not doubted. We just can't investigate everything, and for that reason we are forced to rest content with assumption. If I want the door to turn, the hinges must stay put. We simply assume and live as if the ground beneath us won't melt away, like numbers do exist, like my spouse loves me, and so forth. The moment I act, I must assume. Assumption is necessarily embedded, and to practice, to live, is to certainly act. Considering this, it seems impossible to say that acting is certainty, and if being is action, being is certainty. But this is a possibility to which we will have to return. If to feel certain is to be motivated to be thoughtless toward X, and to some degree we must be thoughtless, as argued by Wittgenstein, then certainty is a necessary risk. We require it, and yet it necessarily makes us uncritical thinkers, which is both the source of its use and danger. If in some way being itself is certainty, it would seem that the nature of being is to orient us toward it as thoughtless, uncritical, and unphilosophical, as we learn in the act of acting itself. Something like this seems to be the case, given that philosophical thought and orientation is so rare, and perhaps contributing to the majority being uncritical is the problematic concept of certainty itself. Section 4. If when I say I am certain that X, I mean I am secure about X, then the words secure and certain lack distinct meaning, and they indeed seem similar. What I am certain about is that which I feel secure in not thinking about, and that I am motivated to assume. A fact, for example, is that what I can feel safe to rely on as a truth of the truth, and yet, if I am too secure, I could be lulled into making the mistake of considering a partial truth as a whole truth, of confusing a truth with the truth. Certainty implies a security, and yet paradoxically also a vulnerability in the same way as does love. To love something entails to love someone entails feeling safe around them, and because we feel safe, we are willing to be vulnerable. If we are unwilling to be vulnerable, though we might actually be safe, we act as if we are not, and so in practice imply loved ones are more so threats than cherished. Love entails a vulnerability we accept because we feel that if we let our guard down, we won't be hurt, stabbed, or deceived, on purpose at least. In fact, for letting our guard down, we become able to engage in a way of life that we believe is far better than the life we should have lived with our defenses, we would have lived with our defenses always up. The vulnerability of love is a risk that seems worth taking, and if humans require love, it is a necessary risk. In love, it is in vulnerability that I feel secure, and so it goes with certainty. When I rely on a fact like 2 + 2 = 4, I leave myself vulnerable to the possibility that this is false and that the premise will let me down, and yet the reason I am willing to make myself so vulnerable is precisely because I trust that I won't be disappointed. Certainty is a secure vulnerability. Like love, it entails faith that it will be worth it. And if Wittgenstein is right, then certainty, to some degree, is necessary. Then it is also necessary and inevitable that some parts of my life entail intellectual, secure vulnerability, per se. Certainty is a personal conviction that entails risk, and yet the word implies there is no risk, or so I would argue the average person takes it, and this is a reason why we are confused about certainty. Similar things could be said about love. We come to think of loved ones as those that wouldn't hurt us, and yet because love necessarily entails vulnerability, hurt is an inescapable possibility, intentional or not. When pain comes in love, there can be overreactions likewise. When what we're certain about turns out to be false, we can overreact and become epistemic nihilists. Understanding that love entails vulnerability can help us cope with its disappointments and shortcomings without abandoning it, and the same could be said about certainty. Certainty is fallible, yet necessary, as love seems necessary too. It will disappoint us, but we can grow from it. Section 5. If when I said I am certain X, I meant I am right about X, there would be no meaningful difference between certainty and correctness. Certainly, I can be both certain and correct about something, but though the two rivers often merge, they are still distinct. For years, some people were certain that the Earth was the center of the solar system, and though even some scholars told them they were correct, they turned out to be wrong about what they were certain. In fact, certainty, a sureness of seeing clearly, may have contributed to their blindness, as certainty may be contributing to blindness of people today regarding some ostensible truth. And yet, something like certainty is needed for functionality. Certainty is the necessary precondition of vulnerability that makes both facts and truths of truth possible. If I was unwilling to rely on anything, then there would be no meaningful difference to me between things I experience and facts. I couldn't jump from saying this is something I have experienced to saying this is something constant regardless the experiencer, rightly or wrongly. Again, to say I'm certain that X is true is to say I have reason to rely on X, not so much that X is true or that Y is wrong. Certainty is a self-judgment that could ultimately prove incorrect, which hints at why we may need to consider a new term altogether, as will be discussed. To say I'm certain that X is to suggest a vulnerable way I am toward that which I have reason to think I am justified to believe, regardless the rightness or wrongness of X. Considering this, it is helpful to separate in one's mind certainty from correctness altogether. Certainty is walking, facts the road, truth the destination. If I go the wrong way, does it make sense to blame my capacity to walk? Certainly, I couldn't have ended up in the wrong location if I couldn't walk, but it also wouldn't have been possible for me to head in the right direction. To blame walking would be for me to blame what makes possible travel in the first place. Without walking, I couldn't end up in the wrong place. No, but discussing ending up at all would be to discuss nonsense, a waste of words that could only cause confusion. Walking seems to be exceptionally low on the list of what's responsible for my error. A much more direct candidate would be my own ignorance about directions, my failure to bring a map, and so on. Knowing I need to walk can help inspire me to exercise and keep my strength up, but if I fail to do this, my capacity to walk isn't to blame, but laziness. As walking makes possible going any which way at all, so certainty makes it possible for me to relate to the world as solid, as something I can rely on, necessary for me to live. Correctness and accuracy aside, certainty is a kind of giving solidness to life, to make living possible. And as it wouldn't make sense to blame my capacity to walk for my ending up in the wrong location, it doesn't make sense to blame certainty for my being wrong, no more than it would make sense to blame my capacity to experience itself for my experiencing sadness. I can only want to avoid sadness because I can experience, meaning I must assume what I want to deconstruct, and yet certainty still feels like it's part of the problem. Why? I think this brings us to discussing how there seems to be two kinds of certainty at play, one certainty of which seems to be macro and the other micro. I am certain that I am experiencing this keyboard on which I am typing, and I am certain that I am arguing something useful, though I could be wrong, though I am not so certain that this paper is easy to understand. Are all these kinds of certainty the same? Perhaps, and indeed they all have something to do with relying on, but the certainty that I am experiencing seems much more given than the other two, so much so that it feels more appropriate to use the word certainty when referring to certainty that I am experiencing than certainty that my keyboard will work and or certainty that my paper makes sense, alluding to the thought of Descartes, though I can't be sure that my keyboard isn't in fact about to break, though I can't be certain that everything I'm experiencing isn't in fact a dream, I can be certain that I am in fact thinking and experiencing, and even if a machine is making me experience things that aren't there, false experiences per se, I'm still experiencing them. Unlike Descartes, I am not sure from the conclusion that I must be thinking that we can conclude I am. Perhaps it's more believable to say I think am, but I do think we can be certain that we are in fact thinking and experiencing, though perhaps nothing else. Considering this, it would seem that the word certainty best fits in statements like, I am certain that I am experiencing, I am certain that I am thinking, I am certain that I am feeling, and so on, very macro and contextual statements. Certainty isn't so much a thing in the world or something that applies to things in the world as it is something that applies to the whole world itself. It is more so an atmosphere than it is a thing. It is a context or background, more so than it is a text or thing in the foreground. Certainty is a horizon, not a thing on the horizon. To be meaningful and less confusing, the word certainty shouldn't be applied to things, but to way things are taken in, feelings, experiences, thoughts, and so on. It doesn't make sense to judge my level of certainty because I participate in certainty when I judge. It doesn't make sense to be certain of what I am doing because to act is to be certain. Certainty adds an unnecessary level of consideration, like thinking I am experiencing the sight of a cup versus I see a cup. What use is the addition am experiencing the sight of? Perhaps no problems arise, but where there is more complexity, there is more likelihood for error, and the more time that passes, the more that error will occur. We have discussed certainty as a thing in epistemology for too long. In many ways, certainty is epistemology itself, per se, the ground of its possibility. Certainty is thinking, for embedded in thinking itself is certainty. To discuss certainty and thinking as if distinct is to discuss nonsense. Likewise, certainty is experiencing, feeling, and the like certainty, thinking, feeling, and experiencing entail vulnerability and knowledge of and toward what is considered felt and experienced. To walk is to take a risk of getting lost, of something happening, and yet walking makes possible the gaining of the value of experiencing something new, of seeing new places, and so on, and so it goes with certainty. We cannot experience without extending certainty. Certainty and experiencing almost seem to be similes. Certainty is a structuring more than a conviction, and since we must extend certainty toward everything to experience it, everything can potentially make us feel more certain than we should feel. You can't think of X without being unconsciously certain that you are thinking about X. To think of X is to be certain of X to some degree, to at least be certain that you are experiencing X, even if wrong. The problem seems to start when we ask, can we be certain about this thing in our certainty? Of thinking the existence of macro certainty is evidence of the possibility of micro certainty and or blurring them together, like confusing beings with being, according to Heidegger. If it is more valid to say, I am certain that I am experiencing a cat-like thing, than it is to say, I am certain that that thing is a cat. We can be completely certain that we are experiencing a cat, only incompletely certain that the thing is a cat. I can be certain that I am seeing a table-like thing, but not that the thing is in fact a table, versus an illusion, and so on. Our problems seem to have come from thinking we can be certain about things in experience, versus only about experience itself. We have failed to settle with being certain about the horizon, and attempted to be certain about what falls along it. To ask, can I be experiencing my experiencing is nonsense, as is asking, can I be certain of my certainty? It is like asking, can I make a thing its background? Even if I couldn't do so without changing the thing into something different, perhaps something only partially what it was originally, and thus not itself. To say I'm certain that I can factualize truth into truths/facts, I am certain that I am thinking, these are phrases where the word certainty meaningfully applies, but what are the situations in which these kinds of phrases are meaningful and useful? Very rare ones, classrooms, abstract discussions, and the like. Considering this, why do we talk about certainty or use words like certainty as often as we do? Understanding that only partial certainty is possible, which arguably isn't certainty at all, perhaps it is time we cease using the word certainty as much as we do, and instead habituate ourselves to a new word, one that better suggests our actual situation and being in the world. Section 6. I would now like to present the main argument of this paper. We should stop using the term certainty so much in favor of confidence. Something like certainty is needed, for we need to make judgments onto the degree we know things in the world, and yet considering what has been argued, I think it would be best to reserve certainty to refer to backgrounds and contexts like thinking and experiencing themselves, because in regard to things in the world, certainty implies the possibility of verification and far too little possibility of error, or at least now it does because of how we are habituated to using the word. Throughout this work, when words like certainty have been used, often the word confidence would have been better suited, but before making that transition, the argument of this paper had to be laid out. Forgive me, but I had to go through certainty in order to come out of it, as Heidegger engaged in metaphysics to escape it. We need a word to refer to a sense that something is solid, per se. But considering that ultimately we can be certain of nothing but the fact that we are experiencing itself, we need a word that implies less certainty than does certainty. Perhaps I'm incorrect, but confidence strikes me as fitting the bill, especially if one's confidence is grounded and justified by epistemological methods like falsification as opposed to verification, an impossibility, as argued by Karl Popper, that I believe the word certainty implies isn't outside human possibility. Furthermore, confidence implies probabilistic thinking, which is ultimately the best we can do to organize our world. I can never be 100% sure it will rain today, as the phrase "I'm certain it will rain today" implies, but I can make an estimate that there is a 60% chance, for example, and thus it's 60% rational to bring an umbrella with me and 40% irrational. When it comes to things in the world, we can be certain of nothing but confident about much. Yes, I can be certain that I am experiencing, but the usefulness of this certainty is very little indeed. For years, the fact we could be certain of nothing has led people to believe that there was no way for us to intellectually navigate ourselves through life, contributing to epistemological nihilism. With the work of Karl Popper in mind, however, focused on confidence as opposed to certainty, though we can never be completely sure we are walking through life on the right road, we can reach a point where we have reason to think we aren't. Though we may always be wrong, we can still be confident. To believe is to risk. It is impossible to ascribe to a worldview and not put ourselves at risk of being wrong. Confidence implies this more so than does certainty, a word which can remind us to be intellectually humble. Furthermore, to think of beliefs as things we can be certain about versus confident in can be problematic. For example, where there is certainty, it is easier to develop a control spirit, to develop intellectual arrogance, and to fall into emotionalism. Certainty implies the impossibility of being wrong, or a strong improbability of it, inviting pride, extremism, partisanship, and the like, while confidence implies subjective conviction and intellectual examination, but not objective infallibility. To think of one's beliefs as matters of confidence versus certainty, I believe, will help habituate people to a healthy level of uncertainty that will also make them more comfortable with not knowing, making them less afraid of unknowns and existential anxieties. Confidence also entails more checks and balances against pride, extremism, and so on, precisely because it refuses to grant people a sense of objectivism that justifies extremism, emotionalism, and the like. For a long time, humans have acted like the only two epistemic options are knowing nothing and being certain. But there is a third way. I am confident that X. Confidence is humbler, but not too empty, per se. Saying I know nothing is humble too, but not true, for I know I am experiencing, and no one lives as if they know nothing, to allude to Wittgenstein. Certainty is also false, except in very limited circumstances. Saying I am completely sure that X can never be accurate, for there is always the possibility that someone is wrong, even say about math, though there may be no reason to think that one is wrong. The word confidence implies what is closer to reality. We have reason to believe much, but can never escape the possibility of being wrong. Where there is a sense of confidence but not certainty, there is epistemic humility and hesitancy before assertions of correctness. Judge Hand once said that the spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. And if this is the case, where there is confidence, it will be more freedom than where there is certainty. Where there is certainty, there could be less of a sense that one is free to intellectually explore, to try new things, and the like, without ruffling someone's ideological feather. Certainty is too closed, but confidence isn't too open. Confidence implies a flight through air, while certainty stands on solid ground, though there is no ground. To practically live best, we should act as if things are true, but think about them in a way that keeps us epistemically humble, and I think the word confidence is more likely to help us strike that balance than certainty. No, I don't think switching from certainty to confidence solves epistemological problems like those discussed in the conflict of mind, but I do think the switch can help us be more aware those problems exist, and the more people who are aware, the more likely it is someone finds answers, assuming answers exist. Section 7. Certainty is when we can stand back from a puzzle in which all the pieces fit together and see the image perfectly. Confidence is when we can step back from a puzzle in which pieces are missing, but we can still make out the image. Certainty is a word that doesn't refer meaningfully to a thing in the world, but to processes by which things in the world are taken in or put out. And yet it is constantly used as if it refers to things, causing confusion. To help us grasp the world, we should only refer to things in the world with confidence versus certainty. The phrase "I am certain that X" should be deconstructed and rarely used. no more than a phrase like I experience X or I am conscious of X, because the philosophical classroom-esque contexts in which the phrase could be meaningful are so rare, and because the phrase implies a grasp on complete truth that is impossible, contributing to error, temptations to control, emotionalism, and so on. Understanding that certainty is mostly impossible, but that confidence is more than possible, may seem to be a meaningless and picky distinction that lacks practical consequences, but I would argue that this is not a case. Some advantages. First, you're less prone to overconfidence. Second, you're less likely to be ideological. Third, you're more likely to be open to new ideas and corrections. 4, you're less likely to moralize certainty and believe it's a sign of weakness for a person to change their mind. 5, you're more likely to avoid cognitive biases. 6, you're less likely to believe in something false, certainty, for example. And when certainty is ultimately shown to be false, we will be more prepared for that revelation without a poor reaction. 7, we'll be more willing to listen to people we disagree with because we understand that they can't be certain about what they think either, so everyone has a chance of being wrong. 8, more likely to go through life assuming we are more wrong than right, generating humility, and so on. In conclusion, we should say, I am confident that X, and when we say this, if meaningful, we say, I have reason to believe X about Y, that X is a fact that is at least part of the truth of Y, a truth of the truth per se. This is because methodology and epistemologically, X has been justified, and hence it is rational for me to believe in X, and hence to feel about X that I can stop thinking about it, that I can rely on the premise X is true and let myself be vulnerable toward it precisely because I feel safe, and yet at the same time I must always be aware of the possibility that X is false, a possibility implied by the word confident more so than certain. Without confidence, considering what Wittgenstein argues, I cannot function, and yet to function I must necessarily risk being thoughtless regarding what I should be philosophical. To live is to live in danger, but where there is danger, there can be life. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit www.ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.